Well, first of all, good evening. Thank you for coming to this book presentation. I have to say this was a very long day for me, so forgive me if I will not be very good in performing this book launch. I also have to say that I really don't like to talk about my stuff. It was actually Alfredo who had the idea to do this book launch, and he said that it was important in the school to have an occasion also to talk about our things. And because I think he's right, and that's why I accepted the invitation. And I'm very, very happy that we are going to discuss the book after. So maybe I will try to keep my presentation very simple and concise, so just that you get an idea before our discussion of what we are talking about. The title of the book is very, I think, hopefully clear about the topic I'm dealing with, which is the relationship between abstraction and our discipline. I guess you all know what architecture means, but abstraction means to pull something out of a totality of which is part. In very simple words, abstraction is how humans seek generic frameworks rather than specific solutions. And you can argue that abstractions, the production of abstractions, is how society is actually organized, through measures, through all kinds of metrics, science, language. In a way, everything that builds our environment is real, of course, is very concrete, but is somehow an instance of many abstractions. And in fact, the point of entry for me for this book was my strong interest for abstract painting. Here you see actually two very beautiful paintings by Piet Mondrian on the left and Peter Halley on the right. And what I realized is that abstract painters actually wrote a lot, maybe because for them it was easier to paint, took less time than figurative painters, so they have plenty of time to also write. And something that they write, that's certainly the case of these two painters, is that the inspiration for them of making abstract images was the city. Somehow, especially Mondrian emphasized how his vision of abstraction was almost an attempt to portray or to represent the experience of the metropolis. And in fact, he even rejected the idea that he was painting pictures. For him, his paintings were fragments of a larger environment. And actually, in the case of Peter Halley, as you can see, his work represents something that is actually very real. The title of his painting is Cells and Conduits. And what he really tried to represent is our everyday experience of moving constantly through enclosed spaces and conduits that connect them. So in a way, abstraction, you could say, is something that seeks generic frameworks, but is also something very concrete that we experience in our daily life. Which is something that I also be engaged myself as a painter. Actually, this is actually a work of mine, and it's really an attempt to re-elaborate these themes of how abstraction becomes real, how abstraction is something that somehow is socially produced, but is also something that we experience physically and also environmentally. In fact, one of my wishes for this book was to publish in the very frontispiece this famous photograph by Andreas Gursky, a photographer I like a lot. You know that Gursky was one of the first photographers to to work with Photoshop. So many of his images are constructed, so they're not really real images, but at the same time they're also very real because they focus on landscapes that are very important in our social life. This is actually, of course, a warehouse of Amazon, and it's really photographs that shows how abstractions are very much concrete and often have also an architectural resolution. And that I was, in fact, exactly looking to how that came into being. Unfortunately, I couldn't use this photograph because he didn't allow me to reproduce it in black and white, which I think is fair. And so you can only see it here, not in the book. There were several books that inspired my research. Three especially, which are those that you see in the slide. Karl Marx, Grundrisse, especially the introduction, which I regard as his most important text, where he really focuses on the concept that he called concrete abstractions, or abstractions that becomes concrete in real life. The production of space by Henri Lefebvre, and as you might know, Lefebvre, who is actually famous for his analysis of everyday life. Actually, one of his most important philosophical contributions was really to elaborate the idea of abstract space, which for him is the historical space in which we dwell within modernity, a space that is defined by money, by all kinds of metrics that relate to the way in which space is produced. And another book that was very important for me, maybe the most important among the three, was this book by Alfred Sohn-Rethel, Intellectual and Manual Labor, a fantastic book of a not very well-known philosopher. He actually was a very peripheral figure of the Frankfurt School. Apparently, when he asked to Adorno to be recognized within the Institute of Social Research, Adorno replied to him, look, we already have a crazy guy in the group. Of course, he was referring to Walter Benjamin. So there is no way we can also have another crazy guy. So he remained a very peripheral figure in Marxist, let's say, philosophy. But his book for me was extremely important because one of the main theses of Sohn-Rethel is that the birth of abstractions is in the split, in the separation between intellectual and manual labor. So in a way, manual labor becomes completely subordinated to the abstractions produced by intellectual labor. And of course, intellectual labor is not born out of nothing, but is born out of conditions that are increasingly dominated by commodity exchange, which requires actually a lot of abstraction, not least the abstraction of money, which is one of the fundamental abstractions through which our society is built. In terms of approach, my book was also inspired by two other books, which are books that have been extremely important. They're not really mentioned. I mean, they're mentioned in the book, but they're not direct sources. One is Techniques and Civilization by Lewis Mumford, and the other one is a book by Maria Mies, Patriarchy and Accumulation on a World Scale. And these books actually are books that really taught me how to do research and also how to write or use a particular format or style, especially the Mumford book. In a way, in my book, I really followed the same style of offering like a very large historical critique, focusing on, of course, a specific theme, which is not the theme of these books. I would say even, especially the Mumford book was, for me, very inspiring for the style of writing. I mean, I think, of course, I'm not as good as him. but it's really a book that really triggered me to use this to make this very large scale historical critique. And actually, the kind of approach that these two books put forward, and which was very important for me, is what I would call a meta-critique, which is, of course, in the case of Mumford, a meta-critique of technology, and in the case of Maria Mies, is a meta-critique of patriarchy. In my case, actually, the book is a meta-critique of the architectural project. So, in a way, the book is literally a history of the architectural project from its beginnings to today through, of course, it's not a linear history, it's a very jumpy history through very specific case studies. I deliberately in the book try to avoid to make too many generalizations. I always stuck to concrete examples, and this has always been my credo, that when you talk about issues, you should always refer to something specific, even when you are dealing with something very general. I don't have a lot of passion for general discussions, and that's why the book is, although has this metacritical scale, is also a book that very often zoom into very concrete case studies, and I will show you very briefly some of them. The book is organized in 6 chapters. I think you can read them. You don't, I mean, if you happen to read the book, just in case, you don't have to read them. I mean, if you want, you can, of course. You can also start from the last one and go back, or you can start from the beginning. Although the book has a slight loose chronological sequence, because the intention was really to make a history, if you want, of the architectural project and what actually exists around the architectural project. So the first chapter is a prehistory of the architectural project. So I try to explain how the project of architecture was born, and I try to really understand the way in which somehow a project works. And the project, as you know from your everyday experience of doing architecture, always rely on a plan that is imagined, if not drawn, or if not executed beforehand, the actual building of the artifact. And although sometimes there are very romantic assumptions that in ancient times building, design and building almost happen side by side, which is partially true, we also have a lot of examples in which, even from Neolithic times, so from very early on, there is a beginning of a separation between the moment of design and the moment of building. And this happened especially with the rise of monumental structures, which usually were manifestations of societies that were very large in scale. So societies that were also able to produce a lot of abstractions like alphabets or numeric systems, calculations. And I was, in this chapter, I was precisely interested in this moment that happened in many civilizations when those monumental structures are no longer built with perishable materials like timber, but they are built in stone, which required a much larger building site, much more logistics. Also, the extraction of material had a much more complex and greater scale. Like, for example, in the building of Doric temples, where precision of stone cutting and dressing was far superior than before. And of course, this created all kinds of hierarchies, all kinds of division of labor within the building site. And for me, actually, and I observe in my book, maybe it's not a coincidence that when this passage happened between the 6th and 7th century BC, we also have the rise of money economy, especially in ancient Greece. And of course, the rise of universal equivalent was very important in pushing building sites and buildings to be executed with more precision, with more refinement, also in terms not only of the execution, but also in the organization of the very construction process. Also because architects who designed these temples were often in charge not just of drawing details, but also paying workers and making sure that budgets would be met. And this, for me, is a very important aspect that has always been put aside when we look to these monuments, that we always imagine them as forms that exist in a social and political vacuum, but in fact they were the product of a very large-scale labor organization, which forced builders, but also patrons, to rely more and more on systems that were abstractions, like, for example, measure, like, for example, geometry. Geometry is one of the fundamental tools through which architects were able not just to design buildings, but also to force builders to follow very specific, let's say, notations. And so you see how abstractions really become a rule, a form of dispossession, if you want, of those that were building, who are increasingly subordinated to the mastery of drawing, the mastery of the form that is actually created by the architect. Of course, as I mentioned in the book, this process was not peaceful, it was never black and white. There were a lot of conflicts, a lot of tensions, but somehow you see how within these societies abstractions becomes more and more a ruling condition for those who live in those social situations. The second chapter, in fact, focuses on a fundamental weapon, if you want, a tool through which the subordination of manual labor was accomplished, which is the famous concept of disegno. I'm sure you have heard this Italian word, which became very popular around the 16th century. And disegno doesn't mean just drawing. Disegno is really the idea, the conception of something. Actually, the French word dessin is exactly also has a similar semantic spectrum. And in fact, dessin, the French word dessin, was the link between the Italian word disegno and the English word design, which started to be used in 17th century England. And of course, here I'm really arguing how at first disegno was really the prerogative of architects. I mean, architects were distinguished themselves from builders in their ability to draw, and to draw actually according to very specific conventions that only in the 18th century they will be theorized as descriptive geometry. And this language actually was not understandable by builders, sometimes not even by architects themselves. In fact, it was a very difficult kind of language of orthogonal projection. Actually, architects often had more facility to draw in perspective than in plan and section and elevation. And you see this very well in this famous drawing by Antonio da Sangallo the Younger, where he used actually shadows to render the plasticity of a section that is actually being in orthogonal projection has no depth. So for us, this kind of language, this flatness of a diagram that represents orthogonal's view might be very familiar, but even for architects and artists and even more for builders, this language was very difficult. In fact, one can argue that since Alberti, the whole logic of architectural drawing was to make drawing not intuitive, but difficult. Yet this sovereignty of the architect within design is very short-lived because already in the 15th, 16th century there is a new revolution that changed everything, in my opinion. a revolution that has always been put aside in all histories of Western architecture, although it's a very well-known history in other fields, which is the revolution of military architecture, especially the military architecture that is introduced after the invention, between quote unquote, of course, of firearms and artillery, which completely changed not only the way to design build forms, so in a way geometric rigor, but also calculation of material became even more pressing, but also changed completely the organization of the building site. So construction became much faster than it used to be before. And also introduce a kind of design process that was both very empirical, so a design process that would not rely on any principle or any metaphysical idea of the world, as in the buildings we have seen before, but at the same time also a way of design that was more scientific, that would rely on data, that would rely on all kinds of metrics that were supposed to be out of question. And in fact, very soon this way of design became the realm of engineers. And engineers, even more than architects, became, at least for a moment, the masters of abstractions. They were able to really x-ray not just architecture, but the city, and understand the city as an artifact that is not only made of images and representations and symbols, but it's an apparatus that is really a machine, as you can see from this very famous section by Pierre Pat. And of course, the response of architecture to that condition is this increasing abstraction of building form, which you see very well in the work of Durand, especially in his teaching. There is a section where I discuss his work, which I always found very, very interesting, because he pushed to the limit this standardization, not actually of materials, but of design. So, as you know, Durand taught in École de Polytechnique in the engineering school. And if you read his précis in the first line, he said, well, I'm teaching design to people that have no time to design. So he delivered a kind of quick method, which was based on the grid. But you see actually how Durand is still an architect. He's still trying to inscribe in this generic grid some kind of classical trope. So in a way, you see that also in his work to give up on the prerogatives of architectural form in its most classical, let's say, value was difficult even for an architect that was working side by side with engineers. So this actually, history is briefly interrupted in the third chapter, which works a little bit like an intermezzo. And the third chapter is a history of the urban grid, which is perhaps one of the most powerful instances in which abstraction, which is basically the measured subdivision of land, became in fact the form of the environment in which we live. I mean, we constantly move through rectangular subdivisions, whether they're indoor or outdoor. And in this chapter, actually, I really try to reconstruct this history, not as a fait accompli, not as a natural history, let's say, that grid is rational because is rational, but how, what were the politics behind the proliferation of this way of organizing space. And one of my arguments is that private property and the spread of property relationship was the fundamental deus ex machina behind this cadastral logic of the grid, which in fact worked at many scales, the scale of architecture, the scale of cities, and even at the scale of the globe, actually. This is actually the Jeffersonian grid, actually not really the Jeffersonian grid, but the land ordinance that was derived from Jefferson's idea to cover the entire United States with an isotropic grid and which would allow the state to subdivide the whole nation into plots of land to be distributed to settlers. So what appeared here actually as an abstract serene landscape, in fact, was one of the most violent projects ever built, which literally erased all other cultures and ways to relate to the land that existed before. And in a way, this landscape is still the place, the topography in which we dwell today. And the fourth chapter actually resumed the history that was left a little bit in chapter 2, which is the history of the Western idea of the project, of the architectural project. And in chapter 4, I focus on a moment in which, in fact, the architectural project collapsed under the invention of a new way to build, which didn't require really architects, but was based directly on the power of money, the exchange value, let's say, of capital. One is the emergence of the townhouse, one of the most important housing type in Western Europe and later through colonialism worldwide. And the townhouse is the first domestic space that is born out of the cadastral logic of property. In a way, it's really literally an extrusion of the way land was subdivided without any other, let's say, dominant factor, symbolic or, let's say, based on custom. So the abstraction of the plot is almost embodied in this very, let's say, abstract type. Focus here especially on the work of people like Serlio and Lemué, because they really render that condition in very sharp terms. But of course, the other type that really create this totality of abstraction in terms of built form is the emergence of the factory. And I really described through the chapter how the factory was really an attempt to devoid of architecture of any other, let's say, content, which was not the perimeter wall and the low-bearing structure, and everything else actually was erased in order to make this space as flexible as possible, although the technologies that the factory hosts are the least flexible technologies you can imagine. So in a way, the factory is both a space of constant fluctuations, but also a space where control becomes total, where actually there is a clear way in which everything should work inside and around these spaces. And then in the last two chapters, I focus on the way architects have responded to this condition. In the fifth chapter, I focus on a very important episode, which is very well known. Most of the things that I talk about in the book are fairly well known. I just try to offer a slightly different interpretation. This has always been my method to not add new stuff to our knowledge, because I think we, as Pevsner once said, we know too much, and therefore we know nothing, basically. So my strategy has always been to revisit commonplaces, things that are very well known, but try to shift just slightly their interpretation. And of course, in this chapter, I focus on a very important moment, which is the shift from formalism, rationalism, and constructivism in the early decade of the Soviet Union. And I focus really on this paradox that one of the most quintessential bourgeois project, which was to invent an aesthetic way to appreciate art devoid of any political and social context, which is the project of formalism, became a fundamental methodology for many Russian intellectuals, especially just before and after the Bolshevik Revolution. And in fact, there is this very strange paradox that early so-called revolutionary art was an art that was really trying to undermine any possible way of representation and meaning. And this is very clear in the work, for example, of Malevich, whose abstraction was, in fact, an attempt to put away art from any social or political implication. And that's actually why, at the end, the Russian avant-garde failed, not because they were somehow crushed by some reactionary power, but simply because they were not working for the interest of the revolution they were supposed to serve. But then there is this interesting moment, which is very important in my book, where especially those affiliated with constructivism try to instrumentalize the discoveries of formalism in a direction where form could become a way to organize space in social and political terms. So in a way, in the work of Ginsburg and Leonidov, you have this very interesting and strange paradox, in a way, their work that is very committed to form, I would say almost in a formalist way, but with the idea that form becomes almost a tool through which possible social relationships can be accommodated or even encouraged. This paradox for me is very important. It's one of the most interesting moments in modern architecture, and of course Manfredo Tafuri wrote a lot about this paradox, not in very favorable terms for the people who produce those projects. I acknowledge that irony of history, as he called it in one of his writings, but I still think is one of the most incredible projects in the 20th century. And finally, we arrived to the sixth chapter, which was, maybe it's the most, I mean, I don't like this, but it's the most autobiographical chapter, because he condensed a kind of a medley. You know what is a medley? When you put all the songs together as one big song. So this is a chapter where I have my own greatest hits. The project that I always, on which I wrote a lot, and they have been always very important as a orienting my thinking in architecture, but with the final twist, which you will see in a moment. Of course, Maison Domino, because it's a very, for me, it's a very interesting project because, I mean, you all know the story of Maison Domino. It's this crazy attempt by Le Corbusier to become an entrepreneur, basically. So he was not yet thinking to become, he was still a painter, but he also thought that through applying this new technology of reinforced concrete, he could make a lot of money and then spend all his time painting, basically. And as you know, the whole trick was to design the form through which anyone could pour their own concrete structure and then fill it as they pleased with windows and openings. So in a way, this image is very deceptive because it's not how the building was going to look like. Actually, if you see how Le Corbusier draw the application of Maison Domino, it looks very traditional kind of dwellings. This image actually was done after, and it was published in the Œuvre Complète only when he realized the potential of this model. But actually, there is a detail that I released, and I stress this in the book, which is that in the Maison Domino there is no the famous pilotis. You know, the pilotis is this round column, which became a trademark in Le Corbusier architecture. Here you see just a banal quadrangular pilaster. And somehow, in a way, the introduction of the pilotis in Le Corbusier, and this is actually an argument I took from a beautiful essay by Tim Benton. The invention of the pilotis was for Le Corbusier a way to redeem the brutality of the reinforced concrete structure of the factory, if you want, by reintroducing something architectural. In fact, the pilotis, which is, from a structural point of view, there is no reason why the pilotis should be round. It's almost a reluctant way for Le Corbusier to reintroduce the column in architecture. And in a way, it's almost as if the moment he discovered the POD and he discovered his own architectural language, he moves away, almost after seeing the Medusa, no? He moves away from the very generic condition of this building, as if all his work, all Le Corbusier work, is a way to move away from this moment where he discovered that once a building like that would be put in practice, you wouldn't need an architect anymore. You wouldn't need actually someone who invent new forms, because actually this building was based on a mass production of structures that then people could feel as they would actually be able to do. So someone who actually didn't run away from this discovery of abstraction was Hilbert Seimer. Hilbert Seimer perhaps is the architect more than anyone who really engaged in the most radical terms with the refined conditions of the metropolis. A friend of mine, actually, Jack Self, said that Hilbert Seimer was the punk of modern architecture, because his architecture really stripped bare to very few elements. But of course, the realism of Hilbert Seimer is paradoxical, because his projects were always theoretical. So there is this extreme realism, which is then delivered through theoretical projects, which is a paradox that also Tafuri noted in his writings. And then I describe other case studies where the abstraction of the metropolis and the way in which the cities produce enter even the interior. Perhaps the most impressive case is, of course, the Frankfurt kitchen by Margaret Schulte-Otzky, which was designed as if the kitchen, the very earth, no, of the house, is in fact a factory. So in a way, even the last remnant of tradition is, in a way, mechanized in the form of a space that is no longer a space, but is an infrastructure, no? The scale of the domestic house. And of course, Hannes Meyer's work, which is another of these attempts to accelerate the alienation and abstraction of the metropolis into the way in which people live and work. And finally, I hands up with the Archizone of Stop City, where this abstraction of the metropolis becomes the very footprint of the city, a city that has no whatsoever symbolic or cultural representation, if not of being a non-stop infrastructure for the reproduction of its inhabitants. The twist, actually, of this chapter is to finish with the advent of computational design, which for me represents maybe the last episode in which abstraction really enters our way to produce architecture. In very few words, I try to argue how this project is very related to labor and to the attempt to, in a way, optimize the relationship between design and manual execution. And it's interesting that computation, in a way, it's a paradoxical project, because on one hand, they empower design even more over construction, but it's also the beginning of the proletarization of the designer, whether it's an architect, an engineer. And in fact, the very last bit of the book is an attempt to describe this proletarization of the designer, not only as a loss, which certainly is, in a way, the proletarization of the architect or the designer is a kind of nemesis of what happened in the Renaissance. So in the Renaissance, the emergence of architecture as design implied the downgrading of manual work, the proletarization of the builder, and now actually we are in a situation where the architect himself is being proletarized. So it's a kind of karma, bad karma that comes back, but actually in the book I try to argue how this proletarization is certainly a problem, but it's also an opportunity to dramatically rethink the way in which architecture is produced, especially in the way in which intellectual and manual labor are related to each other. And I think that if we don't really rethink the very ontological core of our discipline, I think we'll be ill-equipped to confront all the big problems and urgencies of our time. Well, I think that's kind of it. Thank you.
Okay, we use this. Yeah. Hello, everyone. Thank you, Pier Vittorio, for this amazing presentation. And in case you're wondering, I am not Christophe van Garwe, and I am also not Tsar Nichols. And
we're only two left.
So. Yeah, so this is what's left. I hope we're not disappointing you. You can claim your money back on the way out. No, I mean it's true. I forgot that we, as in our little group, that we define ourselves as the neighbors. We pushed a little bit Pier Vittorio to celebrate the book. Perhaps because all of us at the time were either working on books or finishing our own books, and we know how painful this process is. So I think the least that an amazing piece of work like this deserves is a celebration. So I think this is mostly what we should be doing today, and give justice to that. Something that I did not have in my note to discuss today, but I was immediately reminded with the very first slide that Pier Vittorio had is of a story that Borges wrote on abstraction. Is the little tale on Funes, the memorion, the reminder. It's a very short plot, but basically Funes, this very tragic character, loses the power of abstraction and basically goes mad because of that. And very famously, because Funes had the ability to perceive every change, so he would see Nina, the dog, and a second later, because the hair of Nina would have grown one tiny millimeter, and he did not have the capacity of abstraction, he would see the dog as two different dogs. So he couldn't realize that it was the same dog, just with the hair a little longer. So because he lost this capacity of abstraction, basically lost his mind. So I think it's kind of fascinating to think this kind of like longue durée history that Pier Vittorio offers in the book, as this very intrinsic yet problematic human condition. And I think I have a few questions about that. But well, I guess what I wanted to do now is to offer a quick reaction to the book, and then there are a few points that I would like to ask you about, and then maybe we can quickly open it up to you guys in case there is questions from the audience. Again, in terms of like celebratory terms, I think at least the book has three amazing, very ambitious ideas that are somewhat fulfilled in it. The first has to do with temporality. So the book chose a very selective time span of nearly 9,000 years, I think. And I think besides it being obviously ambitious in doing that, I think there is something extremely profound when for those of us that work in the discipline of the history of architecture now, in which there's a clear tendency to reduce the scope of discourse and reduce, therefore, the time spans that we discuss. I think it's a very important reminder that there is something valuable in taking these big chunks of of history and work with that kind of like large block. And I think the book is again an amazing reminder of the necessity of that kind of work, and again it's very illuminating now in the slides to see that there is the undertone of someone like Manford, for example, that of course worked with those big chunks of work. So again, this is the first observation that I think is an amazing lesson for both students and us working on the field. The second thing that I found really interesting is, at least my interpretation is that ultimately this is really a book about modernity, and I think it takes the question of modernity very seriously, and I even wonder if abstraction is nearly interchangeable for the word modernity in the book, and maybe I would like to ask you about that later, but I found very interesting to think big about modernity. Again, I think that's something that the book really does and avoids minute differentiations about post-modernity, so it avoids these subtitles and takes, again, a chunk, but at the same time historicizes conditions that we normally assume to a modernity understanding in a narrow sense, to our near past, and puts those trajectories in dialogue with much longer processes, and I think this is extremely useful. So for example, or at least I had the tendency to see medieval time as something in opposition with modernity, and we inherit the discourse of people like Ruskin that nearly romanticize the Middle Ages as this moment in which you nearly picture these free artisans with a lot of agency. They can do whatever they want, they are free without the tyranny of the architect. Yet in the book, Pier Vittorio does not romanticize that, problematize it, identifies that because of the scope and the scale of such projects, there was already what we call now the division of labor, not yet as we would identify it later, but again, there is this very interesting dialogue of pulling threads back in time, and at the same time not romanticizing periods that are, let's say, previous to industrialization. And I think, again, this larger dialogue with modernity, I think, is extremely important in the book. And thirdly, which one should not forget, and perhaps is the most obvious, but is how architecture is presented and debated in the book as the central actor of this history. That again, in our field, I think we have tendencies to do histories of ideas, history of technology, but I think again it was refreshing to what you said, that you are revisiting names, things that are familiar to you. I mean, of course, there's a lot of nuances and things that are novel, but there's this revision of a bouquet of projects that one think knows what they are about, but then architecture is presented as this very interesting discipline, and I think one falls in love again with architecture if anyone had a lack of that at some point, but that there is this very complex set of objects and disciplines through which you can enter a dialogue with other disciplines, but there's also something very specific to architecture that I'm sure people from other fields would read the book, would see the drawings, and would have an image reflected back onto them as well. It's not kind of like consumer of discourse of other disciplines, but enters, I think, in a rather fair dialogue, and puts, and I think it really highlights the value of architecture. So I think these three things, for me, are really inspiring when reading the book. However, I think here I have 3 or 4 points, which I think I see very interesting, strong tensions in the book that I would like to see if you can tell us a little bit more about them. I mean, the first one is something that I think is very signature to your work in general, which is that there is a very strong tension between, I mean, this is a book of critical theory, so there is a strong criticism expressed in the book, but at the same time, it is a book that in my mind tries to offer a possibility of work within this contradiction, so there is a tension between a critical aspect and an operative aspect, if I'm allowed to use this word, that I'm sure you know what I mean by that. So when you define this critical history of abstraction, or this critical history of the architectural project in this longue durée, there is a critical attitude to it, but you're also seeing it as an opportunity. Can you tell us a little bit more what's the agenda of the book?
Yes, I mean, the book is a critique, so it's a meta-critique, and the critique is not criticism, so it's not saying something is good or bad, or 2 stars, 3 stars, or 5 stars. Critique is that you try to lay down on the table all the things that you want to discuss, and you try to understand what are the structural problems, what are the possibilities and the limitations, without actually trying to force like a judgment, okay, then let's go for this or let's go for that. And this attitude comes a lot from my teaching. I mean, you have to understand that all my books are coming out of the teaching. Actually, one of the seminars to which I built my book was taught here at the EPFL. And for me, teaching is exactly that. You don't tell the student, you know, we go this direction and we support this idea. You very hopefully, patiently, you just lay things on the table. You, of course, disclose the ambition or the hypothesis that you are putting forward. And instead of actually sending very strong manifesto-like messages, you just explain, you know, maybe we can do this, maybe we could that, maybe we can rethink certain things, we can re-challenge certain tropes or certain moments. And that's the, if you want, the ethos of my books. So I agree with you, there is an operative dimension because I'm an architect. I try as much as I can to practice. And a lot of ideas comes also from that, even when I'm doing the spreadsheet or I have to pay my employees, you know, this kind of tedious but important things that you do when you run a practice are very important because you encounter the contradictions of what we do as architects. But also the teaching, which is this really attempt with the students to open up a problem and to analyze this problem and then eventually to find workable hypotheses, but without actually forcing the whole operativity of the book to a too strong message or solution, let's say.
Yeah, no, but this word contradictions, I think, is extremely important because, I mean, again, I was asking you if one could nearly use interchangeably abstraction for modernity of what you're trying to say in the book, and I was reminded of one of the most classical, but I think yet still valuable definitions of modernity of the people like Bernham, you know, and Marshall Bernham, because, you know, he was the one that really wanted to highlight the value of contradictions in modernity, that it's not possible to deal with modernity if we don't accept that contradictions are at the core of its ethos. And then I wanted to stress, because I think in the book there's also this tension between this phenomenon of abstraction. Can we attribute it to modernity, yet a more longue durée modernity, or is merely a human condition that is almost inevitable, that is just there, which is kind of like the Borges thing, no? What do you think?
So, no, abstraction is not a natural fatality of human nature. As I argue in the book, of course, every human being is capable of abstractions, but abstraction really as a social condition escalates, especially with the rise of large-scale societies. And for me, the rise of large-scale societies was not a natural event in human history, was often a political project, especially how to organize those societies. And we've seen that in certain societies, abstractions became a fundamental tool for governing. For example, one of the fundamental form of abstraction, writing, was not born to write poems or stories. It was invented to compute quantities and things. So in a way, the emergence of large-scale societies made abstractions a form of governance that then of course, is already at work in pre-modern, so-called, between quote-unquote, societies, but escalates even more with the rise of capital, because capital requires that everything that exists can be measured and can be evaluated, can have a value, basically. And this has major consequences in which everything is developed, including building, including design. So in a way, I really want to, I hope the book is not saying that abstractions has always been there. Actually, abstraction is a prerogative of a certain kind of form of social organization, which then became paramount. Starting from what we conventionally call modernity, from basically the 15th, 16th century onwards. But there are instances of abstraction already before. And in fact, I follow my actually historical narrative is more or less similar to the one by Alfred Sohn-Rethel. And for example, he really argued how one of the very beginning of a social synthesis dominated by abstraction is very evident in ancient Greece. And he made this incredible, one of the most radical arguments I ever encountered in a book, which I think is fairly convincing, that even philosophy or any form of knowledge that involves abstraction happen at the moment in which societies start to be dominated by an economy where abstractions becomes very concrete. So think of the invention of geometry and mathematics. Of course, this existed before ancient Greece, but it's only actually in ancient Greece that mathematical and geometrical thought becomes not only axiomatic, but also completely removed from any concrete reference. And I think this power of abstraction certainly is not natural. There are many cultures, many civilizations that have never arrived to this level of abstracting things. There is one argument that I didn't make in the book, which would have required a lot of philosophical and skills that I don't have, but that has been suggested by a theologian, a very important one, Walter Burkert, who believes that, in a way, religion was invented and practiced by many cultures to limit the power of abstractions, which I found a very interesting argument, which I would love to explore maybe in the future. But which I didn't have the time and the ability to formulate in my book.
Because you spoke now about governance, and I think in the book there's another tension of architecture understood in relationship to construction.
Yeah.
And at the same time, there are examples of architecture having nearly nothing to do with construction. For example, the projects of Durand, but also of Arkisun. So there is this tension of, all the tools of architecture developing to administrate larger construction sites, deal with the problems of labor condition, administrate larger amounts of people, more complex forms, but at the same time there is the things that are not material about architecture that also exercise governance, like grids. And so, again, can you speak a little bit about this double dimension of abstraction that you have in the book, both related to construction, but at the same time to everything that is not material, quote unquote, in architecture?
Yes, because abstractions, as I argue, are very ambivalent. So they are always somehow intentionally and deliberately opposed to our physical and sensual experience of the world, but at the same time they then produce a very specific concrete reality. And often even architects that were able or didn't realize their own ideas, they gave a glimpse of this ambivalence. This is actually very evident in the work of Durand, because we shouldn't forget that Durand was not designing these precise or these theoretical models in vacuo. He was teaching in the École Polytechnique. He was very much side by side with engineers. He actually had a very good relationship, apparently, especially with Perronet, the most important really figures of the École Polytechnique, and his architecture was really tested against this know-how of engineers. And actually, when you look to projects done by some of the former students of the École Polytechnique, which was founded in 1795, and Durand was one of the professors. So when you start to see the work of the first engineers that graduated in the École Polytechnique, you see that they really applied Durand's work. Actually, it's one of the Durand approach became really the norm in the work of many Napoleonic and post-Napoleonic engineers, because he really offered the only way to produce architecture at the moment in which architecture has lost completely any whatsoever agency over construction. So in a way, it's architecture that is so devoid of any, that's why everybody thinks Durand is boring and it's, dry. It's, but that thing was not his, he was not inventing that language. He simply was adhering to a reality like the convex adhere to the concave, in a way.
And I'm going to end with how ends should end, which is, with this, I think there are a few suggestive ideas towards the end of the book, which are not directly formulated as I'm going to formulate them now. So I was really curious if this was the intent, because now, you said abstraction is not a human condition. It emerged historically at the time of a certain kind of necessity due to forces of capital, of governance, of administration. But the book seems to suggest towards the end that this relationship between project and abstraction, because of our means of production now, has come to an end. That idea that you trace it back to projects 8,000 years before, but really accelerated in the 14th and 15th century, had now come to an end. And it seems to suggest that ideas like project have reached an end. Also ideas of type and typology that are extremely, at the core of the disciplinary discourse of the last 300 years also seem to come to an end. So with the advent of the digital and the production of these new forms of infrastructures that you debate at the end of the book, can we claim that we are seeing the end of the architectural project?
Well, it depends. I think that, especially to writing this book, although, as you also mentioned before, I love architecture, and architecture is not only my primary interest. I'm not interested in I'm not interested in sociology or politics or economy. I'm interested about architecture, and I teach the history and the theory of architecture. But that doesn't mean that you don't question and challenge, even radically, what is architecture and how it can be, how you can imagine architecture differently, or how you can think building without architecture. Because we really have to understand that from day one, the whole idea of architecture is really the separation of intellectual and manual labor, which in the book I argue this is a fundamental problem, which was first the skilling builders, now is the skilling architects. So even if I love architecture, that doesn't mean that I simply remain in contemplation of it. I mean, the book is really trying to deconstruct, and the solution to that for me is not actually to be found only in the architecture itself, but really in the institutions, including the university, that organize and distribute its knowledge. So abstraction for me, it's neither good or bad. It has fundamental challenges. It's also actually an incredible socialization of knowledge. We shouldn't forget that. In the book, I really stress also this aspect. It's just that at the moment, abstraction being governed by interests that are certainly not to distribute this knowledge evenly, this knowledge is an enemy to many people and to many of us. But the moment we can reclaim this knowledge, in its totality, perhaps we can think of it also as a tool. And for me, the only way to do that is socialism.
Okay, I was hoping to finish there, but this I cannot resist. Because, you showed Lefebvre in the first, one of the first slides, and he describes abstract space as the space of capitalism, right? He describes it very prominently, what airports look, what banks look, that you can find them everywhere, anywhere you go. But in the book, he also asks, is there really an alternative to that? And he says, are we going to find socialist space in Karl Marx Allee, in Stalin Allee, where he called it in Berlin, and these monumental gestures? He said to himself, of course, no, that can't be it. And he left that question like in suspension mark in the book. What, if there is going to be an alternative to abstract space, what would it look like? Do we have examples of that?
Yes, there are examples. Actually, one of them I presented in your course. I mean, for me, the Longhouse, for example, I mean, it's only one example among many in which the way in which architecture or building, I would say, is produced, is taken care, is lived, is, of course, the opposite of what I described. But of course, you can say even the Longhouse, there is a minimum of abstraction, because in every building, abstraction is the idea that rule the making of a building, especially when a building is very big and requires a lot of organization and a lot of planning. But the way in which these buildings are produced, certainly they counter this division, of intellectual and manual labor. But there are many other examples, and also examples of monumental structures. certainly, I don't think it's correct to say that only if you make something small. For example, another beautiful example that I'm sure you all know is we're discussing this afternoon, is the super blocks of Red Vienna, where, as you might know, there was a deliberate attempt by the municipality to avoid the use of concrete and the use of prefabrication. I mean, prefabrication was only limited to the finishings, not just because the municipality liked very ornamented buildings. Actually, some of them are even fairly abstract, but because they wanted to change the labor conditions in the building site and avoid the skilling and alienation of
the guilds
of technologies. So there are many examples like that where abstractions were. I mean, the abstraction that I described in the book is countered, and in a way, my previous book, The Possibility of an Absolute Architecture, was also an attempt to establish, maybe in more simple terms, this dichotomy between an architecture that embodies the abstractions of urbanization and an architecture where there is a surplus of political imagination.
Amazing. With this surplus of political imagination, I'll just open it up if there are questions from the audience.
Yeah.
I think I can speak up. Can you listen to me?
The microphone is arriving.
Thank you. Thank you so much. That was absolutely great. One thing that struck me of your presentation and your book is that you seem to be working at the same time with two levels of abstraction, which Marx also deals with, right? So the abstraction of the division of labor that results in alienation, but also the sort of larger abstraction, right? Which he describes as objective conditions becoming subjective, right? Which in architecture, I guess you could identify it with this moment in which abstraction becomes a language, right? And you analyze these architects that seem to have leaned into it and sort of understood abstraction not only as objective conditions, but also as the subjective possibility of using it to design something. And I find it amazing that you describe this process of separation, but at the same time, this moment in which there's a sort of reckoning, right? When the engineers appear, and suddenly this language doesn't have any meaning anymore. And I was wondering if you think of this relationship between these two levels of abstractions, which we could call like concrete abstractions and abstract abstractions, right? Abstraction as language, as being completely separate and encountering each other in particular episodes, or as two things being constantly together. Because
No, I think you put it very well. I mean, there is one as I said before, one of the inspiring, for me, text to rethink abstraction was Marx's introduction in the Grundrisse, which I think is a fantastic text. If you ever want to read Marx, I strongly advise you to start with that text. And there is this moment where Marx, of course following Hegel, said abstractions are concrete. It's not, the particular is always an instance of general abstractions. And then he said they are so widespread and so powerful that at a certain point they become almost like a subjective experience. And he mentioned a very specific case, which are industrial workers in the United States, where this abstraction that rules everything becomes almost a sense of indifference. And because he said workers can move from workplace to workplace. And that is exactly what I was very interested in. The moment in which abstraction becomes this lived experience. That's why I was interested in Mondrian, for example, because Mondrian really tried to represent that moment. the moment in which abstraction becomes everyday life, which is also what Lefebvre mentioned a lot in his book, where we are spending most of our time sitting in front of a window, where we are just moving from, as Peter Alley would say, from cell to cell. So in a way, these abstractions that seems to be first very material, economy, labor, money, they become very concrete, existential conditions. And I'm really interested in this existential condition of abstraction and how architects were able to render that. And I discovered that usually are the architects that really push that existential, that sense of alienation to the extreme, that are more useful to understand what abstraction is about. So in a way, the book is also, I don't know if that is clear, and that's really a question to you, Alfredo. It's also a kind of critique of this, which is now, very fashionable, this, vanilla modernism. This vanilla minimalism, Like, I mean, the book really tried to destroy that, as much. I mean, for me, that is more of an enemy than parametric design. I just want to. I really dislike the way in which now modern architecture, which was this failed attempt to reform society at the very large scale, is being fetishized as a boutique item. And that's why I conclude the book with an architect that I always admire, who is Hannes Meyer. Because for me, Hannes Meyer, like Hilbersheimer, were really extreme and merciless in showing both the problems but also the possibilities of abstraction. Yeah.
Well, if I have to answer that question,
I mean, that comes across very direct in the book. I mean, to all the kind of like bourgeois attempts to cope with the ideas of abstraction, and it's actually very interesting towards the end how, again, very familiar characters appear under this lens of those who have pushed to the limits the understanding of that condition, and how by virtue of doing that they rendered it to you visible as a potential site of reaction. I was also wondering in that sense that, because some of your figures, both Brecht and Hannes Meyer, then moved to socialist context, in which, again, I know that you articulate this in the book, that because for the most banal modernist reading of abstraction, in the socialist world, abstraction had an institutional break, right? It was not allowed by law, and you had the aesthetics of social realism in place, but you clearly point out in the book that that distinction is at the level of the surface, but we are dealing with the same condition. But yet I was interested, okay, how do you read Brecht's work after he had to cope with more narrative tropes in the GDR, or how Hannes Meyer had to deal with more artisanal guilds and modes of production that he encountered in Mexico, if we're speaking about the same thing.
Yes, actually, it's very interesting to see what happened to especially architects in Soviet Union with the beginning of the 5-year plan. Because the narrative usually is that those architects were defeated or crushed by the rise of Stalinism. And of course, Stalin is the bad guy, and no question about that. So I don't want to get into trouble. And that these architects were too innovative or too liberal or too whatever experimental. But I don't think that is the case, and this is an argument I borrow from Tafuri, which is that the moment the 5-year plan starts, that's where abstraction really happened. So you don't need anymore Malevich or Lissinsky. And actually, the way they react to that moment is that they want to still preserve their own integrity as artists, while the logic consequence of their work was to become pure technicians. And of course, that's a very harsh lesson, but I think even today we have to learn to become a bit of more technicians, let's say, and not indulge too much in our, and I say this to myself first, to our artistic aspirations. That's why in the book I end with this note on Hannes Meyer program for the Bauhaus, which for me is one of the most radical programs for a design school, and not by chance Hannes Meyer was fired from his position as a director.
Okay, I can, everything that I would say, actually I'm in a position that I have a conflict of interest for obvious reason, being part of the same lab. So, in a way, my comment is, in a way, an elogio more serious. I have many compliments, basically, because I think, first of all, as Pier Vittorio also said, this book is not trying to give a direction saying that we should follow this. What Pier Vittorio said, that the way he also uses this for teaching somehow is also the way we work in our lab somehow. So it's a matter of putting questions in the table, trying to discuss them and try to understand how these problems, and to give a more concrete, let's say, definition, at least for us, problem is actually equivalent to examples, to case studies, which are very important. Putting them in the table and trying to understand connections between them. I think that from the backstage, so from other side, from our side, or from our point of view, at least for mine, Pier Vittorio's book represents something that really belongs to his method, which makes him also a great teacher somehow. You know? I think that through our discussions in the lab, every moment, every single discussion, every comment or review with me and also with all of us, it's always a moment when we learn something new on every different topic, which goes beyond the topics that are presented also in the book. Said that, I would also add something else, which is for me also very important. In a way, I think that there is a moment now, a problematic moment that sees both the project, but also the alter ego of the project from the perspective of the academia, which is history, or the teaching of history of architecture, which seems to be a bit of without orientation, no, somehow. And in a way, the book, it's of course a book of the history of the project, so it links the two problems together, and it tries also to discuss and to give a more clear orientation of not how these problems have to be solved, but at least how we can go back in a way to deal with history as a problem, but also as a subject that has to be restructured within the university. So I think that in this, let's say from this point of view, Pier Vittorio's book is really a guide of really how to deal with history, and also how architecture actually could deal with history of architecture.
Can I ask you one thing?
Where are the pyramids?
I mentioned also the pyramids.
Yeah. So the pyramids are there in different civilizations, but they're not part of a capitalist system. So does abstraction also take place within systems outside of your narrative? So that's just for future reference. So, what I want to ask, two things. One is that I'm baffled slightly by the fact that we have a particular political system that is actually brought in drastically to explain something. What about the introduction of the metric system, which for me is the utmost form of abstraction ever put in place? So where does the universal measuring system stand in all of this? And given, so I think this is food for thought and discussion in the future. And also because Jefferson did not use a universal system, he used a labor-based system in America. But given that you've done this here, in a school, and there is a lot of contribution from teaching, And we are in this space here. So here on this side, there is something that celebrates architecture and abstraction. On the other side, there is an exhibition that celebrates architecture and empiricism, and the opposite of abstraction. So bricolage, complete abstraction. Is this are these two opposite theses within the same school? Are they opposite faces of the same coin? Is there a complementarity there, or there is an ideological distinction?
Regarding this question, I'm not the curator of ArchiZoom or this space, so I think topics like bricolage and empiricism are absolutely valuable topics. And I still have to visit the exhibition, so I'm really looking forward to see it and carefully. I don't think there is any battle of ideas. There is no querelle between empiricist and abstraction, to my knowledge. Regarding the first comment, yes, I mentioned, in fact, the question of, especially in the chapter of the grid. And I also mentioned the pyramids, but for me, these are, I think, as you know, actually, the invention of the metric, of the meter, actually at the end of the 18th century is just the consequence of a very long discussion and the process of uniformization and standardization of measure systems. So I always avoid in my book to claim that there is one thing that there is a new invention, or I never believed in this scientific invention. For me, they are always the product of very specific social and sometimes political circumstances. So I always refrain myself to claim in the book that there is one building or one system that change everything. There are a few moments where I insist on the sudden, I use the word revolution, of course, which is a bit of a tricky word to use in those kind of narratives. And one of them for me is really the impact of firearms and the way they forced a completely new way of building. But I just exaggerate that a little bit, the emphasis, because it's a chapter in the history of building that has always been neglected in histories of architecture. I mean, it's a very well-studied topic from engineers, from historians of military design, occasionally by some historian of architecture, but has never been really addressed. And for me, that moment is maybe a crucial moment where, going back to the issue of modernity, where a modern idea of building and design really starts. Which, and then maybe I created this kind of momentum that you move to the invention of the meter. And the other, for me, interesting moment is, of course, the invention of the factory. Because I think that the invention of the factory is another of these moments where a new wave to organize building emerged. And this way of building then influenced all kinds of building types, from housing to office to infrastructure to anything. So there are moments of sudden change, but I really try to downplay this, this sort of history made of big inventions.